There's so many options today in shooters. You can play casual shooters, serious shooters, and everything in between. It hasn't always been that way. There was an era where the shooter started to get stale, where, on the face of things, everything was fine, but really, things were headed for disaster. There were a few games that did things differently, even when their compatriots succumbed to the beige horde. Thus, we enter the Gilded Age of Shooters. Let's go over what that even means. Gilding doesn't mean golden, although that's what it kind of sounds like. Gilding is where you cover something cheap, like wood, in a thin layer of gold plating so that it looks like gold. So shooters really boomed around 2010, and then we entered a Gilded Age. There were a lot of shooters coming out, and a lot of them looked the same. It's not that people didn't innovate, we're going to look at some of those innovative games today, but it's that there were so many games coming out that fell into a similar beige template. For example, let's look at Medal of Honor Warfighter. It's a shooter. Came out in 2012. I bet you haven't heard of it before, though. Medal of Honor had been a big franchise, but this game looks and plays like budget Battlefield. The art design is basic beige modern military. Cool. Uses the same tired guns and same tired game modes as every other game coming out at the time. Oh, wow. Your main game mode is Domination. Wait, sorry, I meant Conquest. Wait, sorry. Actually, I meant Sector Control. Sector Control is what you call it. This game killed the Medal of Honor franchise, and it got the studio shut down. And there were other games coming out just like it, and people started to get tired of that. Shooters went into decline during this era, and then a few games saved the genre. But we already did that video. Today, we're going to cover some of the best shooters of the Gilded Age. Let's start with Titanfall. Man, I love this game. Titanfall came out in 2014, and unfortunately, it only came out on the Xbox One. I think this game would have popped off a lot harder if it was cross-platform because this game was gas. When everyone else was doing modern military shooters with AKs and M4s, this game went into the future and had wall running, a gun with homing bullets, and most importantly, mechs. I mean, mechs are cool. Come on, man. They're just cool. This game felt so far ahead of its time. The movement options felt really fluid. You could jump and then boost, and then wall run, then jump and boost again, and land on an enemy mech and take it out. It was crazy. The game gave you so many opportunities to make cool plays, whether big or small. This game did do some weird stuff, like the random dinosaurs that were flying around, and like the burn card system, which gave you power-ups that only lasted for one use. It was a little weird to get a super powerful gun for one life, and then it's gone forever. Super creative, though. The team really abandoned a lot of what was standard for shooters at the time. Burns cards might have been kind of a miss, but I really like the main game mode of the game, Attrition. Attrition is kind of like Team Deathmatch, where your goal is to just kill the enemy players. The wrinkle is that they added AI teammates. They're super weak, just mooks for you to take out, but they do give you points, so it added a layer of complexity to the game. You could try to farm the AI, or you could try to punish other people for trying to farm your AI. You could even pretend to be a bot, and then just punish the enemy for not taking you seriously. And we can't ignore the Titans. It's called Titanfall. If you liked mech combat, this game did it well. The mechs felt sufficiently slow and methodical, but they also had satisfying guns and enough cool movement options. Titanfall is the only game that I know of that does a good job of integrating mechs into a standard shooter where you have regular guns. They nailed the feeling of playing a pilot, so you don't mind playing with a regular gun, but it's also still exciting when your Titan charges and you get this massive power fantasy. Titan-to-Titan combat is complex enough. Like, this isn't Mech Warrior or World of Tanks, but you still got some strategy and variation. Plus, the weak AI in attrition mode made it feel even better to play as a Titan because you always had hordes of weak enemies to mow down. I've got more to say about Titanfall, but if you're enjoying the video so far, subscribe so you can get more content like this. I want to talk a little bit about the general design of this game. Titanfall was Respawn Entertainment's first game. The studio was formed by Jason West and Vince Zampella, who were the guys behind the Call of Duty series all the way up until Modern Warfare 2. They had pioneered the shooter genre, and during the Gilded Age, many people tried to ape their game design. So it would have made a lot of sense for them to leave Activision and go make legally distinct Call of Duty, like so many other people were doing. But they didn't. Instead, Titanfall is a very distinct art style that's different than the beige template we were looking at earlier. They use a lot more color. Titanfall also takes after classic Western mech designs. There's also Eastern mechs, like Japanese mechs. They look a lot more like this, and that's where you get games like Armored Core, which focuses on really fast-moving mechs with exaggerated designs. Titanfall goes more after the Western tradition, with things like Battletech, which has slower, heavier mechs. It's a lot grittier and serious. The mechs in Titanfall function really similar to tanks, except for they're about 5 times cooler, and they walk on 2 legs. Titanfall did a great job of marrying grittier mech designs with more colorful maps and characters than you saw in other modern games. Titanfall 2 is a much better known game, and it is a better game, but Titanfall 1 really innovated. By the time Titanfall 2 came out, there was more variation in shooters. I wish these games would come back. Now, let's look at a less successful attempt at innovating on shooters. EA published Titanfall. They also published the Battlefield series. They decided that those games needed a refresh. So a year after Titanfall, EA put out Battlefield Hardline. Battlefield Hardline was basically Battlefield 4, except for it was converted into cops and robbers with bank heists, zip lines, and just regular old muscle cars. This was a pretty fresh take on shooters. I mean, games like Payday existed, but Hardline was a typical large-scale multiplayer shooter with all the trappings of a Battlefield game. I loved the idea when they announced it, and me and the boys picked it up. It just didn't really work together. The game was so clunky. The grappling hook and the zip lines were a lot more complicated to use than you wanted. The overall map design didn't really work that well. I mean, multi-story buildings with destruction looked really cool, but it got really complicated to actually move up and down between floors to steal money and to capture objectives. Most of the time, it also didn't feel that much different than Battlefield 4 with a new coat of paint. The zip lines and grappling hooks felt at odds with the typical Battlefield play patterns. It felt like a discordant mishmash of game ideas. The frustrating part is that a lot of these ideas totally work together, but they did need major adjustments. The Finals is basically Battlefield Hardline done right. There's a lot of differences between these two, but the major one is the Finals went with multiple teams of 3 rather than 2 teams of 16+. It makes the game feel a lot less chaotic. The objectives in the Finals really force you to use the movement abilities that they give you. Also, the Finals doesn't have vehicles, which just felt kind of superfluous in Battlefield Hardline. One thing you could definitely say for the game, though, is that it did try something new. Hardline was a miss, but it was a kind of creative miss. Let's talk about one of the most creative shooters to come out, maybe ever. Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare. This game looks like a meme game, and it's clearly made for kids. So why does it go so hard? There's a lot more going on in this game than you'd notice at a first glance. It's a class-based hero shooter. The plants and the zombies have completely different classes. Plants have the pea shooter, the sunflower, the chomper, and the cactus, while the zombies have the foot soldier, the engineer, the scientist, and the all-star. Right away, these two sides are not symmetrical. There's no plant equivalent to the foot soldier, and there's no zombie equivalent to the chomper. All 8 are completely unique, which opens the door to some interesting objective game modes, but we'll get to those in a second. These days, the main hero shooters are Valorant, Apex Legends, and Overwatch. Garden Warfare is older than all of these, and it took more after the godfather of the hero shooter, Team Fortress 2. Like in Team Fortress 2, Garden Warfare has variants of each of the classes. Some of these are kind of minor. The fire pea shooter is the pea shooter, but it can set people on fire. Wow. But Dr. Chester, the Cheetos tie-in version of the scientist, yeah, there was a Cheetos tie-in, don't worry about it, has a fully automated shotgun instead. And each class has multiple versions of their abilities they can choose from as well. The class variety in this game goes way beyond any other hero shooter, and it means that it was a surprisingly deep class shooter. You had a lot of considerations based on map, and game mode, and team composition, and enemy team composition. With the asymmetrical classes came asymmetrical game modes. The main game mode, Gardens and Graveyards, had zombies attacking the plants in a base defense mode. The zombies won by capturing each point one at a time. They get more time for each one they capture. The plants won by holding out for long enough on any one capture point for the zombies to run out of time. For the most part, this played like a regular objective capture mode. Because the zombies always attack and the plants always defend, the plants were balanced to be more defensive than the zombies. It reminds me of like terrorist versus counter-terrorist balance in Counterstrike. There was a decent amount of map variety for the first few objective captures, but the really unique part comes on the last capture point of each map. Zombies would have a unique objective for each map. Like on one map, they had to destroy a massive flower. To do that, they had to shoot out of a cannon onto an island. Plants had AA guns. I mean, they were actually just plants and pots, but Plants vs. Zombies logic. Not all of these complicated objectives quite worked right. I remember hating playing as zombies on the map where the last objective made you walk up a hill against a hail of walnuts. I mean, D-Day's interesting in concept, but I don't really want to play it. But map-specific objectives are something that most modern shooters are shying away from, and it makes me sad. They not only give you some much-needed variety, they also give you more knobs to balance with. Maybe some classes are only good on some maps because they're good against certain objectives. It gives you another out from the game just turning into play the best comp of heroes on every map, every time. Not that modern hero shooters have that problem. Class balance also could have used some work. Pea shooter and foot soldier just felt better than any of the other classes. I mean, healing is cool. We like healing, but this is still a third-person shooter. You know what's good in third-person shooters? Shooting. A gun. Also, rockets and grenades are pretty good. There were also some classes that were clearly at the bottom. The chomper was a really cool concept, but in general, running directly at someone who has a gun is not a good idea, and that was how the chomper had to play a lot of the time. Plus, it had a huge head, which made it foot soldier food. These sort of things are mostly solvable through balance. That's not really how most shooters were made at the time. Better to just make a sequel that solves the problems of the first game game than to make balance updates for free. The second Garden Warfare game is better than the first, but I played the first more. It added more classes and made a version of the main game mode where the zombies defended and the plants attacked. Otherwise, it's basically just the same game. This game really offered a breath of fresh air among some of the more stale games coming out. It's too bad the series hasn't really continued, at least not in a good way. The type of game that should do amazing these days. This franchise deserves so much better than it got from EA. Speaking of EA, I mean, this video is starting to feel like an EA video. Trust me, there's other publishers in this video. But speaking of EA, let's talk about a game that kind of fumbled again. Star Wars Battlefront is so close to being a great game. First of all, this game looked amazing. I mean, no, actually, it still looks amazing. The graphics still hold up. The maps look great, the sounds are good, it's oozing juice. And the gameplay is, it's okay. Also, there's like barely any game here. The shooting was all right. The gun choices are limited, and they're all laser guns. Blasters are great fun in moderation, but they also don't tend to have things like recoil or fall-off damage or variety. That meant playing as a regular soldier just felt a little bland and generic. In the older Battlefront games, there were more set classes with varied weapons, and you used points to slowly move up from a basic soldier to Darth Maul. In this Battlefront, you had to grab a token that was out on the map somewhere to play as the hero, which meant that people just camped the tokens. Yay! This also brings us to the other big problem with this game. There was no content. On launch, there were 6 heroes in the game. Luke, Leia, Han, Darth Vader, the Emperor, and Boba Fett. So 6 heroes, and only 2 of them had lightsabers. Dang. The game only had like 4 maps. It did have 9 game modes, but most of those were terrible. This game had nothing going on, and it cost $60. You could play it for about a week before you get bored. And then what? Are you gonna buy DLC that's really expensive and also adds very little? I mean, okay, with the way I'm talking about this, you would think that this game was terrible. It wasn't. The gameplay was just really repetitive, and the main game mode didn't work very well. The heroes versus villains mode worked though. This looked like a total gimmick to me, but I'm glad I gave it a try. The heroes each had a surprising amount of depth, and the mode gave you 1 life. So you had to actually work together with your team and take fights tactically. You had to protect your healer and position around lightsaber guys and get good map position. The mode had so much more going on than it had any business having. Heroes vs. Villains had enough going on to just be its own game. Unfortunately, 6 heroes just isn't enough to make a varied hero shooter, especially when you see the same 6 every game. Battlefront is a great they tried kind of game. It's a really solid 6 out of 10, and it makes sense why studios would look at the way the game turned out and decide to just make another cheaper beige shooter. The last one of these less successful attempts at change comes from a game that most people really didn't like. Halo 4. Halo 4 is the first Halo game that 343 Industries made. Bungie made the first 3 games, then they left Microsoft to go make Destiny. Halo 4 was video game. I mean, this game kind of felt like it was doomed to begin with. I mean, Halo 3 ended the storyline, so Halo 4 had to come out and start something completely new. The story was kind of weird, but the guns did look cool. They felt okay, they felt a bit derivative, but they were okay. People hated the changes to multiplayer though. They added sprinting and they lowered the time to kill by a lot. They made Halo feel a lot closer to Call of Duty. I think the game had serious problems, but it's probably a bit overhated. The sprinting did feel good, but it kind of ruined the timing on Halo maps. Maps really need to be designed around the movement options you have, and so Halo 4 could feel a bit claustrophobic at times. They adjusted a lot of the guns, and again, they felt closer to COD guns. I think they did go too far, but some of the ideas worked pretty well. The assault rifle went from being dropped the instant you could find anything else to having a real place in your arsenal. Lower time to kill didn't quite work for Halo, but I did like how it took some of the emphasis away from grenades. So many engagements in Halo 3 and Halo Reach come down to hitting someone with a grenade and then doing a single headshot, or breaking their armor and then hitting them with a grenade. Halo 4 did not hit the sweet spot, but it felt like an acknowledgement that the Halo formula needed to evolve. Some of the other games around that time just tried to keep doing what they were doing, and it led to whole franchises just dying. Halo has never reached the heights of Halo 3 and Reach again, but at least Halo 4 tried to. The last game to cover from this era is a weird one. For the most part, these shooters have been console first, in some cases, console only. Let's go over a PC game, Counterstrike Global Offensive. They did release CSGO on consoles the same time they released it on PC, back in 2012. It just didn't work very well on console. Tactical shooters can work on consoles. Rainbow Six Siege, for example, is more popular on console than it is on PC. Counter-Strike, though, didn't work for people on a controller. They didn't have aim assist, and Counter-Strike requires pretty accurate aiming. It also has very precise movement with acceleration. This means you can control your character pretty well with a keyboard and mouse, and far worse using analog sticks. Anyway, Counter-Strike is not a console game, so that version got abandoned. CSGO was an aberration when it came out, an anachronistic look at what shooters had been. While the Battlefield and Halo series were learning from Call of Duty to be faster paced and more arcadey games, CSGO stayed close to the Counterstrike formula, which is funny because at first, even Counterstrike fans didn't like it. CS exists in a universe apart from regular games. It's a Valve game, TM. Valve games are weird and janky, and the jank becomes part of what people like about them. A lot of the mechanics that are core to Counter-Strike, like the airborne movement and recoil patterns, are morphed out of engine quirks and limitations. So, CSGO, of course, came with its own batch of new quirks and intentional changes. But also, like most Valve games, TM, CS fans got used to what it was and moved over to CSGO. Eventually, CSGO found its audience and really started to grow as a game. It was one of the few true alternatives to shooter norms. It boasted a lot of things that are more common in games now, like an MMR-based ranked system. Today, we've covered a lot of games from across the shooter genre, but none of them come close to CSGO when it comes to mechanical expectations placed on players. Counter-Strike requires you to aim. There are very few ways around that. You can't spam grenades, you can't switch to a different class, you can't get into a tank, you can't call in a Titan, or turn into Darth Vader. You just gotta get good. It's the fighting game of shooters. This sounds really intimidating for outsiders, but there's a secret about these get good style games. Now listen close, because we don't want to let everyone hear, okay? You ready? Most of the people who play these get good games are really bad. Even if CSGO is much harder to play than Titanfall, most of the people who play it don't have perfect aim. They don't know every map inside out, and they don't know callouts for each location. They're just as bad as you are, and some of them are worse. So, even though CSGO was more hardcore, harder, less forgiving than most PC games during the Gilded Age, a lot of people still played it because it was much more accessible than it appears. And other shooters don't appeal to grinders the same way. The guy who wants to get good, to improve, to keep getting better at aiming. He's pretty limited in Battlefield, and even in Garden Warfare. Counter-Strike was counterculture, and it worked. It also had something else that no other shooter has, even now, a skin marketplace. CSGO skins are a rabbit hole that we don't have time to fully explore. To make a long story short, Valve pioneered loot boxes and made it so you could open cool-looking skins for your guns. The big difference from most modern games is that you can actually sell your skins. Given the size of CS and the rarity of the skins, there's actually a lot of money in Counter-Strike in a real economy. I still can't believe that this skin, which I got for $20 a few years ago, is worth 40 plus now. Like, guys, really? Now, there was also that whole gambling thing. Yeah. And people trying to use CS skins as a real investment vehicle. Those people make up a tiny fraction of the general player base, though. For most people, it's just nice that there are cool skins being sold for what the player base thinks they're worth, rather than being marked up to $30 for no reason. Instead, your fellow man is just marking it up for $30. Skins are cool, and they definitely help CS, but I think CSGO persisted because it is the antithesis to the Gilded Age of shooters. In some ways, it called back to a simpler time. It didn't have complicated progression systems, it didn't have 17 game modes or a dozen different ARs. It revolved around methodical gameplay and aim. It appealed to people who wanted more, a deeper, more competitive experience. It was the opposite of the shallow, throwaway nature of the Gilded shooter. Shooters aren't perfect now, but the genre has a lot more diversity than it used to. There are just so many good shooters out there, but you don't even have time to play them all. It didn't used to be that way, though. We went through a Gilded Age of shooters where an endless procession of beige copycats threatened to kill the genre. I just wanted to appreciate the games that dared to do differently. Thanks for watching.